Did we scare
Okay.
people off when you said that you were going to be reviewing some of my pages?
Yes. They're like, I'm not coming to that.
Yeah, forget that.
But for those who did come, welcome to Happy Hours with me, Eileen Cook. It is July 17th. And as Cynthia so correctly said, we agreed to do some page reviews today. So yay on Cynthia for turning in pages.
Well, thank you for the offer.
Of course. And the offer stands for you as well as other people. We're going to be trying to do this as well as query letters. So I'm going to give Bonnie a chance. She was doing a query letter. I don't know if she wanted to revise it before we reviewed it publicly. That's up to her.
Yeah. Well, I was going to do the revision you suggested first, and I had a statement to put in. Just haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah. I completely understand that. And I love your Tinkerbell mug. That is fabulous. So in reviewing pages, I wonder if Cynthia, if you could start, can you just tell us a little bit about what the book is about?
Yes, I can do that. It's, I've been thinking about this a lot. I did a total rewrite after my course with you,
Yep.
Eileen, and you probably get a sense of that when you look at the pages I sent to you. And I have changed the story somewhat and the characters and tried to kind of pare it down. And Max is my protagonist. He's 12, almost 13, days away from being 13. And he thinks he's pretty special when he discovers that that objects in his grandfather's antiquities collection allow him to travel back in time. And he sees things from their past, and then he discovers that all the men in his family have the same trait. So he feels a little bit less special. But his father and his grandfather do not talk to each other, and now they're living in the same house. And the reason they don't speak is because of this gift. And so the story, as it unfolds, you learn about that. But what Max does is he takes this opportunity to learn about the objects in his grandfather's collection. But when his grandfather goes missing, because he's a famous antiquities authenticator, and he gets into trouble with the trafficking gang. When he goes missing, Max uses his gift to help find his grandfather. And of course, he has to involve his dad, who's very reluctant to participate because of his background, his history. So I don't have my pitch yet figured out, or my
So that wasn't it?
blurb. That's not it. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's the story. That's not the elevator pitch. We're still going up to the 200.
It's a very tall building. Yes.
Yes, but anyway, I don't have a pitch yet, but that's the gist of it. So there's no dog in this story.
Why'd you get rid of the dog?
I know, I had to, but I'm doing a separate dog story.
I'll see how I feel about that later. Not sure how I feel about the loss of the dog. So I do feel a little bit of an advantage with these 5 pages because I do have a sense of the story overall, because I've read much more when you were part of the SFU program.
Yes.
So what I want to do is I'm going to do a screen share here so that you can see the pages as I sort of talk through them. And then I will also send these back to you, Cynthia, so you don't have to do some kind of mad scramble to try and write down my notes.
Thank you very much.
Period. But I don't send them to everyone else because they're not my pages. So they're just going to go back to Cynthia. But I'm going to talk sort of in specifics for Cynthia's pages, and then also try and look at what are some of the bigger things that we can talk about. All right, so let's see if I can master this screen share here. All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yay, I love when technology actually works. And so far, and I'm probably cursing myself, we're getting a good internet connection, so I'm all around happy.
That's great.
All right, so we're just starting right at the very top of your 5 pages. So some of the things that I pulled out, and you'll see there's comments as I sort of went along, or around particular details. So one that I, like the honey glow of the light, I think was important, just because that's a very specific and it has a warmth to it. But in particular, I wanted to highlight warm like the Egyptian sun hanging in the air. Now, the reason I thought that was important is whenever you're starting pages off, you're trying to do so many things all in a short amount of space. And what you have done here is sort of set this feeling that we're already in Egypt, which is, of course, where we are. So you're getting that setting grounded in right away. So just a couple of things in this opening paragraph. So the door swings open, the hinges screams, a honey glow envelops Max and his family. That made me think that the light was coming from the cabinet. And I'm not sure if that is in fact the case, but I wanted to sort of make sure we were on with that. Max had yet to meet the occupant. He was the first to step through the door. So I highlighted this just because the he could be the occupant or Max.
Okay.
So just to make it clear, I'm almost 100% certain it's Max. But just to know that readers could be clear. And then he was the first to step through the door. And then my question is he stepping through the door of the cabinet or into the house?
The cabinet.
Then I think we need a bit more description, because when I think cabinet, I think like kitchen cabinet.
Mm-hmm. But you do learn very quickly that the cabinet of curiosities, is using the term from the 18th and 19th century, being a little mini museum within a house.
Yeah. So I might even say the door to the cabinet of curiosities, a room-sized space swung open.
Okay.
Just something, because I think well, I was going to say young readers, apparently all readers, because I'm almost 50. And I was like, what is this cabinet? Still young in my own mind. But I definitely think particularly younger readers, like I was thinking cabinet even in terms of like a large cabinet, which might be like
a wardrobe.
Yes, but I was still like, okay, he steps inside that thing. But I'm thinking younger kids are going to think cabinet like kitchen cabinet. And the sort of universal thing that I want to pull out for everybody who's thinking about that is thinking about your readers, particularly if you are writing for younger readers. Now, one thing you do quite well, Cynthia, is you keep this very timeless in terms of when the story takes place, and it would age well for readers. But the other thing I always mention for adults who are writing for kids is to make sure you get your time references correct. So the example I give is from myself. So I was writing a YA, which is a book for teens, and I was writing a line in it that said something about the trench coat mafia, which was a reference to Columbine. And my editor said, they weren't born when Columbine happened. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so old. But it is that idea that those things can change. Like if you are writing for someone who is, 13 or 10, and you reference something that's 15 years old, they're likely not going to know what that is. So to keep that in mind, or conversely, if you're writing for teens, and also to keep in mind that our references do change and shift. So if you're using movie references that speak to you because you grew up in the 1980s, so you're mentioning all the Breakfast Clubs and various things. Kids today, they may have seen the movie, but it was on the oldies channel. So it's like asking you about a John Wayne movie that you were forced to watch with your dad. So just don't assume that someone who is younger is going to know those references. So that's the universal thing, just in terms of cabinet.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So the renowned antiquities collector Archibald meets. So then we're getting into him. And then it says Archibald would look at each object to know if it was real or fake. And even though Max's dad rarely spoke of his father, Archibald, Max knew all about him. So I think, one of two options, and it depends which way you want to go, Cynthia. Either to make it clear earlier on, renowned antiquities collector Archibald Mead, Max's grandfather, had lived alone at the villa, or make a bigger deal out of this big reveal, because it sort of reads almost as like an aside here. So I would either make it clear right at the start that this is his grandfather, or I would make it some kind of a bigger deal. And the best, and this is really weak, but, Archibald could look at the things. The best thing about this antiquities dealer is he was actually related to Max. And then He really had spoken of his father, blah, blah, blah. Something like that, so that we're getting a bigger bang. Because again, I could see someone tripping over that and not necessarily picking up on it.
Okay.
And then again, just in terms of getting bang for the buck, is Max has dreamed of meeting this man made famous in magazines and books. And I think there would be also a thing, and this guy's related to him. Like, that's like, the kid equivalent of finding out, oh, by the way, Indiana Jones just happens to be your uncle. What? Taylor Swift is your mom's sister. What? Like, he seems like, he's got some hero worship, which makes total sense for me because of who this kid is. And this is telling us a lot about him. Like, those are great character details because not every 13-year-old cares about Egyptian antiquities.
Yeah.
So the fact that he finds this really cool tells us a lot about him. But I would definitely probably play up. And there's also this sense, and whether or not that was maybe what got him interested in antiquities, was this kind of mysterious grandfather that his dad doesn't talk about. But that's pretty cool. Like, he knows this guy. Scrolling down, you'll see that I made one word a contraction. So was not a holiday into wasn't. And that's just my thing that comes, strangely enough. There's a book called, and I'm going to screw it up now, I think it's called something like Building a Bestseller or the Bestseller Code. I'm always sure that's it, actually. And I think a lot of the book, I'm not sure I necessarily buy into. But the basic premise of the book, it's nonfiction. There was a selling feature for that book, wasn't it? I did find it a really interesting read, but it's basically where this group of people, scientists, loaded in all sorts of books that had made bestsellers. And their premise was then they could run your manuscript through the same algorithm and tell you the chance of whether or not you would be a bestseller. And they, had a bunch of things about their predictive ability, and they tried it with different manuscripts and all these kinds of various things. So while some of it, I think you just can't quite make as formulaic as they were attempting to do. One of the things that oddly has stuck with me long since that reading of that book was the idea that using contractions was connected to bestsellers.
Ooh, okay.
And the reason that they put forward, which actually makes some sense to me, is the idea that it picks up the pacing. So even just reading it aloud, his parents reminded him that this was not a holiday. His parents reminded him that this wasn't a holiday. Like, it's just that infinitesimally bit shorter, which picks it up. And in general, we associate bestsellers or commercial fiction with pacing in a lot of cases. So anything that sort of tightens that up. I would also add, just sort of strangely enough, is using contractions lets us sound in some ways almost more accurate. Like, most people talk in terms of contractions if you're listening to dialogue. So it sounds kind of right to us. Yes. And I think not using contractions just is a touch more formal, which works really well in dialogue if you want to have a character, like maybe you want to have an instructor, or for example, I can imagine the grandfather talking like he never uses contractions. And if you find that you generally use them and then you don't use them in certain cases, they will pop more. So again, if you're wanting the grandfather to sound more formal, or someone who's maybe speaking English as a second language, so some of the police characters that I know you have later, I can see them using that was not what a vacation, right? And it's part of that more stilted speech. And I think it would pop just a tiny bit more. So I think we're just getting in these first few pages, which is really nice. The fact that they're moving to Egypt, that they're starting over, that mummies can wait. So we're getting all this great detail around he's a fish out of water, which is a great place to be writing for a middle grade in general. They love those kinds of stories. So that's all great. And that he's this different kid, right? Like the fact that I suppose actually a lot of 13-year-old boys, frighteningly enough, want to be with mummies, but not universally. So the fact that he's interested, I think helps. And then in terms of, packing in tons of details, he overhears his parents talking about his grandfather's collection. Nothing good will ever come of it. It's the last thing Max heard. So one I like about that, because we're setting up some tension with that. But you can pack a little bit more detail because he spills cranberry juice on his sister's Maggie's lap. So I might just add his older sister, just because it's another chance to slip in a tiny little detail in that spot that just, again, gives us a little bit more. And you'll probably mention it again. Like the thing that I always keep in mind, and which I know drives so many people crazy, is there's so much information that you're trying to get into these first pages. And Bonnie and I have had the discussion around, like, how do you cover when there are dragons and magic? And
It's a
oh, by
struggle,
the
isn't
way,
it?
there was a plague.
I feel like this carries the whole weight of the story. And because of that, I think I have a lot of anxiety about getting it right, you know?
I think the first pages are the hardest pages because twofold. One, you can drive yourself kind of trying to write them. I do think it's easier in revision.
Yeah.
And I think you have the luxury now of, you know, how this story ends.
Yeah.
So you can sometimes play again. I'm always a big person around saying, is there something you can take from the end to put into the beginning? To kind of bookend things.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's something that the character is learning at the very end of the book, is there a way to show it in the beginning that it's different? Or is there a way to show in the start of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker's in basically dusty farmy clothes on this sand planet, and at the end of the book, he's in a military uniform in this glass and chrome hall coming back. At the start of the Hunger Games, Katniss is, you know, who she is, and then at the end we see her, she's back in the exact same place, but she herself is very different. So sometimes it's kind of interesting to play with those contrasts, and that would be something to think about. So then this is just around, again, how much detail to have. So they arrive from London, they get it out, he's so excited to be there, but they didn't know that they were going to move to Egypt when his dad lost his patent and spent family savings trying to get it back. So I don't know if kids will know what a patent is.
Yeah, I actually, since I submitted that, I thought I need to have some like inventions in here so I can, you know, demonstrate that he actually did invent some things. So I do talk a little bit about some of the inventions he thought would be successful, like the dog-driven scooter and the cutlery that you slip over your fingers.
Yeah.
And things that just he spent a lot of time and invested in that didn't make it.
Yeah.
But I don't know about that.
Well, I think the inventions are super fun. So I definitely, and those don't come up here, but it might be as much as it all came about suddenly, and make it like, it's not really that he lost his job, I don't think, right? Because it wasn't that his dad had as a job as an inventor. He just lost the family's savings.
Yeah. I mean, and he was working on his own. So, you know, he didn't have a job, so to speak.
So it
didn't have an income, let me put it that way.
Couldn't she just turn it around and say lost their savings on his last invention?
Yeah.
And later on, you can find out that
like what that actually means.
One of many inventions, and this particular one. It throws in, because it's cool that he's an inventor.
Oh yeah, and kids will find that really cool.
Well, I had to come up with a whole bunch of really obscure things that he could invent, like the cutlery that you slip over your fingers and the dog-driven scooter. Like, why wasn't that popular, you know?
You know, who knows?
And some things became popular that don't make much sense. So, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I would ditch patent and go with Bonnie's line.
Okay.
And that's also nice because, that's why we keep Bonnie around.
You're welcome. Bonnie has too many details in her first pages. So.
So trimming that small one out, I think, makes a difference. And it still sets us up with that he's an inventor, which is great. And I wanted to add in this, talk about this kind of one next line, because I think there's some great stuff. So the idea that his dad has lost their money, whether or not, like, how does, like, that's a lot of heavy stuff for a kid, right? Like, he's super excited to be moving to Egypt, but that's also probably kind of scary. And there are some hints about that, like hard choices had to be made, feels a little bit. Max didn't know if coming to live with the grandfather he never met was the worst thing that could have happened or the best. Maybe just one beat about why it might be the worst. And whether that's because he has to move and leave everyone, or, you know, a hint that his dad and his grandfather don't get along, and so he's really scared about what that's going to be like, or just something that kind of, because I really like that line. Because for kids, then it's, you know, I mean, you're basically, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. You're just channeling Charles Dickens, Cynthia. Nicely done.
Thank you. I work on that every day.
Yeah. Channel the greats. That's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly.
But that line is great. And this line is great because it does show that kind of back and forth between two different things. So just giving us a hint, because so far I haven't seen anything that would make me think it was the worst, other than there's this tiny hint that his dad doesn't speak to his grandfather, and that, you know, there's some tension around the fact that dad has lost his, in essence, his job, right? Like, and that's a highly stressful thing for kids because they often don't fully know what's going on. Because as adults, we correctly don't necessarily share everything with them, which is appropriate, but it also means they fill in. So it could be like, you know, Max didn't know if his dad had lost all their money, or like if they, like, he wouldn't necessarily know all the details, but he's got a bad feeling about what's happened. Yeah, which is nice. This next one is a small one, but I'm pointing it up just because I think it's one of those things that we all do. But you had the line in here, the first time it happened, she tried to smile, but as it continued, Max could see you had plainly annoyed. And I just cut it out and went with annoyed because it struck me that that word didn't add anything particularly to that sentence. And sometimes those are people who had me in SFU know this. My favorite term was microcuts, which I said all the time. Now I hear myself say it and I hear like a little buzzer going in the back of the word. Like, there you go, Eileen, you said it again. But it's the kind of idea of looking for those tiny changes that can, again, just increase pacing and pick things up slightly. And I think it's those small things that can make a little bit of a difference. So that's good. And this is another example here. Max felt a connection to the pockets of darkness in a way he'd never felt in England before. I just took the before out because he never felt it in England, because we're not going to talk about after.
Yeah, that's right.
The next line, I think, just does so much to set some feel and atmosphere for your book. So out there, beyond anything he could see, pharaohs once ruled the land. Ancient Egyptians traveled the same path he was on, and beneath the sand, their ruined temples and tombs lay buried for thousands of years. Like, that whole section is just all kinds of yummy and lovely. And I also think is one of those things that connects to a bigger feeling. So I don't know. I know I certainly have even had that feeling. I've actually been to Egypt. But the place I most distinctly remember, it was a school trip in university over to the UK. And we were standing in a cathedral that had been built like in the, 1300s or something obscene like that. And I was standing on a step and it was kind of worn down. The stone was worn. And I just suddenly got really lightheaded and almost dizzy with the concept of how many people had stood in that space.
Yeah.
And it was this sudden realization of like how completely insignificant I was, which, is a feeling that came often to me in my college years. So it was appropriate.
Ouch.
Yeah, pretty sickly. But I love that connection where Max is now feeling connected to this much bigger world. And I think that's something that is happening to kids at that middle grade age, is the understanding that there was a world before you, right? Because earlier than this is when you don't understand that your teachers actually don't live in the supply closet. Right? Like, it's around kind of, grade 1 and 2 is like the first times you'll see your teacher out at a grocery store, and you'll suddenly see them in like shorts or something, and you'll have this total disconnect. This is around the age when kids tend to get really interested in asking family members, like, tell me what my mom was like as a kid, because you're just starting to understand the concept that your mom wasn't actually just your mom. Like, she actually had a life before you existed. So for Max, this is a very age appropriate thing that he's having. The next description just threw me a little bit, and I'm going to ask Bonnie to read it as well and see if it's just me. So it's, as Max turned his attention to the quiet man standing like a wooden beam attached to one of the cases. Yeah.
There's something wrong there.
Yeah. There's the very type. There's something wrong, Cynthia. I think I was just, because I don't necessarily entirely know what the case looks like yet. So I was trying to put together what the case looked like and then put the guy in it.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking a wooden beam like on the ceiling, and I couldn't figure out how it was attached to a case.
Oh, yeah. Okay. He's just leaning, he's stiff, leaning against the cabinet. Like, he's propped up against the side of it, the case.
There might be.
Okay, I'll work on that one.
Yeah. And just to prove that, like, you can parse things sentence by sentence, his heart bounced until it felt stuck in his throat. I just love this heart bouncing till it feels stuck in his throat. That for me is just all kinds of lovely.
Good.
So super fuzzy warm. Now the next one is just around, again, establishing how much distance do you want to have from the grandfather? Because we say slowly the man's misshapen hands versus slowly his grandfather's misshapen hands. And that's just something for you to consider, because it depends how much distance you want to create with that character. But it feels more distant. But I love misshapen hands. I love the smell of tobacco mixed with flowers and alcohol, all of that. Like, there's just some really nice descriptions. And this one, I think you can go either way, but I just wondered, Max felt the gentle ticking of the watch against his ear. Like, do you feel a tick or do you hear a tick?
Mm-hmm.
I know what you're talking about, because watches have that weird kind of almost,
like heartbeat.
Yeah. But I don't, there was something about he felt the gentle ticking kind of, again, threw me just slightly, but I knew exactly what you meant.
All right.
So that wasn't a bad. And then we jump. And again, this is just to point it out to other people. It's really nice if you are making any kind of time jump, particularly when you're writing younger for kids, make sure that's really clear. And we'll do a debate, because I don't know where the story is, whether or not you need to start the story where you do, or start it at the 2 months later and weave in some of that earlier stuff.
Well, I actually had the beginning at the 2 months later.
Yeah.
And my reading group was like, well, we don't really understand like how he got to this point, or, you're jumping off into this extraordinary experience without us really establishing what's the normal for them. And so I was kind of like, I don't know what to do. So then I hastily put together that first bit as a kind of like, okay, this is how we got here,
I might be more tempted to open where you are here at the 2 months later, and then going back.
Okay.
And then flashing back forward again.
And where does the cabinet fit in all this in time?
It opens, this is 2 months later, is in the cabinet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if the cabinet was a separate time and we'd done 3 different times.
No. No, this is, they're in the cabinet 2 months after that first introduction.
Okay. Yeah. So I may even do something like, Granddad, listen to this, Max began, excitement carrying through his voice. So having this sort of set, and then he, glances up or something, and then you say they're inside the cabinet, and then just tell us, an idea that this cabinet is this thing of mysteries, and this is really bad because it's off the top of my head, but Max could hardly believe they'd only lived here for 2 months. The cabinet now felt like his second home. you know, he hadn't wanted to come when his dad lost all the family's money after his last invention went belly up. But now that they were here, he was thrilled. So, you know, something like that, where you can kind of go through and be like, okay, what are the key things in that opening sentence that are really, or that opening section that are really important? And then how can I potentially just squish
work them in?
Yeah. Because I'm not sure you need the jump.
Okay.
And what you'll find is when you're reading through this, I felt like this section, just in general, just also like this to me is where the story started picking up.
Yeah, well, that's where I had this was my beginning.
Yeah.
Trust your gut. Don't listen to other people.
I know, really.
Say other people. Don't listen to other people.
To those people.
Those people.
Yeah, don't listen to those people.
Yeah, I mean, I think your story does start here.
Okay.
And then, but I think their advice, which is useful advice, which is we need to be grounded in that. You can go in here. So, you know, Granddad, listen to this. Max began, excitement carrying his voice an octave higher. Looted treasure discovered in a Cairo neighborhood, Max continued. They'd only lived in Egypt for 2 months, blah, blah, blah. But Max couldn't stop believing that he got to be in the land of pharaohs and sand where things were still discovered, da, 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 da. Like, and then we're kind of jumping, you know what I mean? More into things. So that for me is where I would do that. And then you're kind of then have a chance to describe the cabin a little bit, right? Because he and Archie. And then again, does he think of him as Archie? For several minutes, he and his grandfather had been silently reading journals, or he and Archie?
He calls him Granddad.
Yeah.
But everybody calls him Archie, even Maggie, his sister.
Yeah.
I think that speaks to the distance that the rest of them have from the grandfather.
Yeah.
But it's either Granddad, grandfather, or Archie. I don't know what else to call him, but yeah. I wanted to get away from using the same thing every time.
Yeah, I would tend to lean towards he and his grandfather Archie, even just to, again, especially if we are now making this the beginning.
Yes. Okay.
And then you might even have a line, something around here, that he was this antiquities. So again, I think you just have some nice descriptions here because he's pulling this modern archaeological times, which I suspect is actually a real thing.
No, I made that up.
Oh, did you? Oh, I was like, I bet that actually is a magazine.
I made up a whole bunch of journal titles.
Because you're weaving
things and making magazine titles.
Cutlery on fingers, magazine.
I made everything up except for the antiquities themselves. Those are real.
So apparently you did it really well because I totally bought that they were a real thing. So I like this because you're getting nice details about the grandfather. We're getting all these stuff about, they've discovered statues, Ramsey SETI, like all of that is setting really important parts of your story and getting it like kids in part are going to read this book because it's about Egypt, right? Like that's the kind of fun bit that they're getting to see and do is play in Egypt. So whenever you can give them those things, I think that's really good. So, of course, when I always say, if in doubt, check the Supreme Council of Antiquities Registry. Is that a real thing?
No.
See, I thought I was like, that could be a thing.
There is something similar, but it's not called that.
Oh, I like your name better.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's way better. And you also then do a nice job of then explaining. So this could be another place, again, if you're weaving in details, where you talk about that grandfather's in charge of antiquities and this, he could look at something just by blah, blah, blah. That's where this kind of thing could go.
Yeah.
And then he's, trying to figure out things for things. Like, again, this is just for me, like I was definitely reading along really quickly. But you'll see that I often switched it from Archie, refilling Archie's tea, which refilling his grandfather's tea.
Yeah. Okay.
Just because I think you want to cement that relationship for him.
Yeah.
And since he's our point of view character, I want him to think of this guy as his grandfather.
Yeah.
Not as Archie.
Yeah.
So this is, again, one where I think you just need to ground the reader. So refilling his grandfather's tea was one of the jobs Max was paid to do. I love the description of the teapot. The fabric of his gloves slipped and the teapot lurched forward. You might want to, like, why is he wearing gloves?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm assessing that he's wearing gloves because he's in an antiquities cabinet and you're not supposed to touch them with your hands.
Oh, well, see, his grandfather knows that if he makes contact with antiquities, something will happen to him. And so until he thinks Max is ready, he makes him wear gloves all the time.
But I think you need something like where Max finds that really annoying that he has to wear these gloves. And he, like his grandfather sometimes touched the antiquities with that. Like maybe his grandfather tells him these things are old, so you're not allowed to touch anything in here without gloves on.
Yes.
Because little kids have sticky things on their fingers and hands. And, Max is kind of insulted because he's not a little kid, right? He would wash his hands before he touched the antiquities. But I think he would think it was weird and annoying. And also for kids, they're going to want to know, like, why is this guy wearing mittens in Egypt?
Okay, I'll be clear about that.
Especially since he's inside, right? And I think
or they could be something like special antiquities.
Yeah, like I think they would be like very like again, like when I first read it out, I've assumed that, of course, because I wasn't thinking of the grandfather making him wear it, like that they wear those thin cotton gloves that you see people put on in museums before they touch things.
Mm-hmm.
But I can just see a kid thinking, like, why in the world is this guy wearing gloves in Egypt? Like it's hot in Egypt.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll be clear about that.
Yeah, and that also gives you a chance to set up. I'm often talking about the difference between mystery and confusion. Like it's a bit of a mystery, right? Like why does grandfather make me wear these gloves? It's a stupid rule. It doesn't make sense, but it's going to stick in the reader's head. Like that is interesting and weird. Why does the grandfather make him wear gloves? Which of course eventually is going to get paid off. But without some sort of setup, we just think it's like this weird thing. Like maybe he's wearing gloves because teapots are hot. A friend of mine has a metal teapot. And if you grab that sucker by the handle, you will sear yourself a nasty burn.
Maybe his father invented it.
Yeah. Not the smartest teapot with its metal handle. Let's see here. So it's the first time he's alone in the cabinet. He's poking around. This was just a small thing. He's in charge of gathering up all the newspapers. Like all the objects in Archie's cabinet of curiosity stayed in the cabinet. So like, wouldn't there eventually like this be this hoarder's cave of newspapers? Like if they never get rid of them?
Well, yeah. I mean, I didn't know that was a detail I should put in.
Well, I guess it's more like if you want it to be like there are stacks and stacks of papers and magazines, and he wonders if his grandfather ever gets rid of them. I
have stacks of books, so maybe I need magazines.
Yeah.
And papers too.
Yeah. Because, yeah, I think of newspapers like I just think of my own house where, you don't take out the newspapers for a week and it starts to really. So if the newspapers never leave the cabinet, like then there are going to be too many newspapers in the cabinet. There will be no room in the cabinet for anyone else. So yeah, that is the end of your 5 pages. So for me, the things that really stuck out that I like is I think you're setting up some fun mystery kind of stuff. Like he's a fish out of water. He's like, basically you have a ghostly Indiana Jones. Like that's pretty cool. Like he has this option to do magical kind of stuff that's taking over. There's some kind of mystery, like, and you can even be a little more pointed around that. Like Max didn't, I think you even have a line like, maybe it's in here. Max didn't know why his dad didn't speak to his grandfather. Mm-hmm. Like, but that would be a weird thing for a kid, right? Like you would know that's weird. I have a grandfather. My dad doesn't talk to him. Mm-hmm. I think, hang on, make all of you dizzy as I roll back. No, you actually don't. You say, even though Max's dad rarely spoke of his father. Mm. So there might be a rumor, just to put a little bit, like there's something going on. Cause even that raises for me, like, if you're not talking about your dad, what's going on with that? There's some mystery there. Mm-hmm. Any questions for me, Cynthia?
I really appreciate you reading these. Thank you very much. I, have spent a little bit of time like thinking through this first bit and how much was really necessary. I have another character, Yusuf, who's really important in this story, and I actually had written a little bit more to the first part than I shared with you, and at the end, Yusuf comes in holding the silver tea tray with white gloves on. And that's when he and Max meet. So I'll have to think about how to, kind of work that into, this is a starting point. But if you don't have anything to do, maybe after I rework it, I could send it to you for a little bit of, this is what we were talking about. Or no, you really didn't make the mark on this one.
Yeah, because here I'm like just going through, like, I think you can definitely probably ditch this. It's almost like a prologue.
Yeah.
Because what this is just giving us information.
Yes.
And I think most of what you have in there could be woven into after the 2 months.
Okay.
That's my one big takeaway from that, because I feel like that's where your story really starts taking off and picking up speed. And you can put those details in there and they'll still work.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll give that a go today.
Give that a go.
It'll be my project while I'm doing laundry.
Everyone should have a laundry project. All right. And Bonnie, how goes your pages?
Well, I sent you a bunch, and then I rewarded myself by not doing anything for 2 days. It was lovely. I'm going to get back to that now.
There you go. Well, and I will get to reading those pages. That's on my list for this week. So we'll go forward with that. But are you feeling now like you're found your way? Because you were working on, you sounded like you were frustrated with it a while ago.
Yeah, I was frustrated, and as soon as I sent the pages, the doubt monsters descended, and the whole story was pointless and full of plot holes. Completely irreparable. But I think that's
as long as you didn't go too far with it, Bonnie. As long as you just kept it to completely unrepairable.
I just think I needed a break, and because we've been working on the query letter, I've been thinking about when you do the stake statement in a query letter, you often say, if this doesn't happen for the character, what is the worst thing that can happen to them? And that's generated a few brainstorming ideas, and now I kind of have to pick one. And I'm not sure quite which direction to take, because it could go quite dark, or it could be maybe a little more on the lighthearted side. So I'm kind of working through that. So it might be a bit of thinking time.
There you go. So I think for both of you, like, my takeaway for people who haven't read your pages yet, of course, someday they will. And I'm curious to get you guys' perspective as people who now have been working on a project for a while. Is there way more rewriting than you ever imagined?
Oh, God, yes. I thought the hard part was writing the first draft.
That, I think, is, for me, was the biggest life lesson that came with writing, which was, I struggled for a long time to just finish a book, because I was the master of starting projects and never finishing them. Yeah, and then I finished finally, and I was like, behold my thing of beauty. And nobody did.
Nobody did.
Nobody beheld that at all. And for me, I actually ended up dropping that project, and I started a brand new project, and I wrote that all the way through. And when, again, that one, no one beheld its beauty either. And I was really frustrated with that process, that I really started to understand like how much revision was required. That that first draft of a story is kind of just,
it's the shitty draft.
It is the shitty draft. And it's just trying to kind of just nail some basic concepts to the wall.
Yeah.
And I think that's why so many people abandon projects, because when they are in our mind, they are genius.
Totally.
Oh, they are the best idea. And you know, if you talk to people, they're like, "Oh my God, that sounds amazing." And you're like, "I know."
No.
Yeah,
Wait
and then
till
they
I
read
write.
your first pages and they go,
Hmm.
Do you know,
It might sound like what you said.
yeah.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Well, for me, I decided rather than shelve this first novel, because it's really been a huge learning for me going through the process, I decided to do a rewrite of it because I knew in my mind that things weren't sinking because I continued to think about it all the time. And it wasn't something I was going to be able to walk away from until I could solve the problem. And so I've made myself, and it's been a bit painstaking because I'm working in a way that I don't normally work, but I think this is probably the way I will work going forward, which is to, you know, blitz out my ideas and then go through and build a framework. And then I can track, you know, the plot and the characters and see how it's all going to work together, which I didn't do when I just hammered out those, you know, 65,000 words or whatever it was that I was all excited about. And then I figured out actually the story doesn't really hang together. All these characters that don't really do anything, they're just there. And then they're not even like 3-dimensional. They're just kind of, you know, ooh, bad Bedouins, you know, run for the hills.
Bad Bedouins would be a great title of something.
Yeah.
Great band title or something.
Yeah.
Like a band name. You're going to be the Bad Bedouins.
Yeah. I probably would be able to go to Egypt again if I wrote a book called Bad Bedouins.
Probably not.
Yeah.
I mean, what I can say is from my process has evolved. So I used to be a complete and total pantser. And then as I started to sell on a regular basis, I was selling on proposal, which meant that the publisher would buy a book from me based on an idea, which is very dangerous, right? It's lovely because they send you a check, but it's dangerous because you're like, oh, I have this great idea. So there's going to be like Bedouins, and then there'll be this kid, and he's going to be this Egyptian kid. And then
he has a dog.
And there's a dog. There's always a dog. Right. And then the editor would be like, that sounds great. Here's a check. And then I'd sit down to write it and I'd be like, huh. So no, I'm not sure what I'm doing. So I switched to being much more of a plotter. So I would, before I kind of formalized an idea, I would do a bit more of the structure thing that you're talking about. But what I found, I don't know if it's discouraging or heartening, is there was still a huge revision process afterwards.
Yeah.
I sort of felt like, oh, if I just do this all upstream, I won't have to do it downstream. And I do think it cuts the amount of time. Like, again, when I look at the first book that I published, not the first book that I did, sadly, but the first book that I published, you know, there was kind of the original idea, and then there was what that idea evolved into as I learned and grew as a writer and as I knew what to do with those kinds of things. So I think the big takeaway is revision can actually be kind of fun. It's super frustrating and irritating, but it's also kind of interesting because you do know the characters. So you can start trying to be like, why did I want to write about Yusuf? Because he's a character that actually sticks out quite strongly to me. And given the world the way it is, I think we could really use a positive portrayal of a young Egyptian boy.
Yeah.
So I think he's a very important character, but like, okay, well, what's his point and what's his purpose and how can I get more bang for the buck for that? How can I make him not just a sidekick, but like where he's got his own thing? And, you know, that becomes to me sometimes the fun, or, you know, for Bonnie, where it's like, oh, wait, like the dinosaurs, like it was just cool to have dinosaurs, but now they have to have a story, damn it. They have to have their own motivations, and like they can't just be the dragons. I called them dinosaurs, didn't I?
It's all right.
Those big beasts.
Those big things. Yeah. I have an issue with dinosaurs and dragons and confusing the two of them. Apparently, in my mind, they're all kind of the same. They lived a long time ago. Right? Yes. As far as I'm concerned, they're the same thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think you guys are doing a great thing for revision. And I think people have choices. So I don't want people to feel like you have to keep revising, because I think you can also get to a point where you can kill a story. I did some chatting with someone that I met at a writer's conference, and she comes to the same conference every year. So I see her pretty much every year because I go to the same conference. And she's been working on the same book for 10 years.
Wow.
And this last year, I finally got the guts up to say what I'd been kind of wanting to say for a while, which is I think you need to put that book aside and just write something else. And that is a very personal choice. And sometimes people have asked me, like, do you think I can fix this book? Like, is it worth saving? And that's a nearly impossible question for someone else to answer, because it's like, well, what do you want to do? Like, and for me, at least for one of, my early books, like, it wasn't that great of a book. And it wasn't even that I loved it. Like, it was, for me, it was a learning adventure, and I'm glad I did it. And I still have it. And I, sometimes when I want to feel good about myself, I pull it out and look at it and I'm like, wow, I'm way better than I was back then. But it wasn't worth revising. But for other people, I do know they have worked to revise something because they really do love the story and they want to figure it out and get to it. But either way, the process you're going through, I think, is valuable, which is, what can I learn by revising this book? And it's going to help you with this book or any other book that you write down the road.
Definitely.
In my opinion.
I agree.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I will call us to an end. Let me know if anyone has any specific questions that we should tackle for next week. And otherwise, I will find an interesting topic for us. And we will
well, I should have my query for you for next
week.
week.
Well, then we can.
Yeah. I'm going to be putting together query letters, so I'm really interested in. I'm not working on it at the moment, but I'm going to be next month. So.
Well, and one thing to think about.
New level of hell. So.
Yeah, really.
If people are willing, what might be interesting, Bonnie, is like if you have two different versions, because I know you were playing with two different ideas for a query letter. And anyone might, like, if you have two different, like, I like this one, but maybe I want it to be more like this, we will allow people to read them because they're just one page. They're very short, right? So people can read it at the top of the thing. And then we'll do a poll as to which one people liked better and why. Part of this will drive you insane because you will suddenly come to realize the subjectivity of all of this. Yeah. That what one person likes, someone else doesn't. But it can also just, I think, be really interesting to know, like, what's hitting for people. That's a fun thing. So we can do that.
Yes.
All right. We'll go write all the things. And I will hopefully see you all back here next Tuesday. And I will see you, Cynthia, in person, I think, next Wednesday. But Wednesday, Tuesday, somewhere in there.
Wednesday. Yes.
Wednesday. All right.
Super. Look forward to it. Thank you very much, both Bonnie and Eileen.
You betcha. And I will send you these pages. All right.
Cool. I appreciate that. Bye.
Bye. Writing.